All right, good morning, friends. I've got myself a neat little microphone, and I'm talking to a camera because that's a normal thing people do, and there's no reason to be nervous about it. I want to make a video talking about the leg extension machine, how versatile it is within our training, and how it gives us a chance to talk about the nuances between different contraction types and where they can fit in our work. So the leg extension machine is a great way to isolate the knee extension part of quads. It's important to kind of note that it's not going to be useful for the hip extension kind of action in quads, and it's certainly not the only way to train your quads to be prepared for the demands of running, jumping, riding a bike, any of that. But it is an invaluable piece of equipment, especially if you've had trouble with your quads or your knees or the tendons that cross your knees. So if you've spent any time thinking about training in the gym at all, you've probably come across this idea of contraction types, or the three sort of actions that muscles can have. Muscles obviously can shorten. That would be a concentric contraction. So if we think about in the leg extension, I'm simply extending my knee until I've got as shortened a position as possible and I feel that full muscular squeeze. So most people using this machine are going to start there. But we also have our isometric contractions. Isometric contractions involve no length change of the muscle, even though the muscle is contracting and creating tension. Isos can be of two different varieties that are different for the tissue and different neurologically. A pushing iso or an overcoming iso involves contracting against maximal resistance. So if I put the pin all the way down to the stack and I'm not mega strong, then I'm going to be able to contract with one quad or both as hard as possible, pushing into that pad, and I'll be able to sort of stimulate the neuromuscular quality of recruiting as many motor units as possible. So it's a very isolated, very safe, very mid-range position to work on reducing inhibition with the quads and just driving up that level of maximal strength, among other things. Other types of isometrics would be yielding or holding isos, where we're holding a position. Neurologically, this is interesting because you have to contract at a level that holds the position. I need to not contract so hard that I fully straighten my leg if I'm strong enough to, but I also need to contract enough that I don't lose the position as I go. So these can be done for a lot of different reasons with a lot of different intents and load schemes and durations. I tend to think about holding isos in zones. So long duration of 45 seconds or greater with moderate tension is really good for reducing inhibition, starting the process of tendon remodeling if you're having a tendinopathy issue, and just building general stamina. So ISO zone 1 for me would be holding positions like a fully extended leg or a mid-range position here for greater than 45 seconds. Zone 2 for me is much heavier and more difficult to hold, and I look for like 20 to 40 seconds. Those are much higher effort, and we'll often see this in-between contraction between an isometric and the lengthening eccentric that people call an EQI, eccentric quasi-isometric. So if I hold a much heavier weight here, I'm going to drive up with 2, I'm going to switch to 1, and if I try to hold this for 40 seconds, I'm not going to get there, and I'm slowly going to lose that battle despite my best effort. So it's not a wholesale super maximal eccentric where we're lengthening. We're certainly not lengthening and lowering the weight on purpose, but it happens because I'm losing due to fatigue. So there's this really nice stimulus that comes from that. EQIs seem to be very, very potent for strength and hypertrophy and things like that. So it's a good bridge to prepare somebody for lengthening and more dynamic movement if you're starting with just isometric stuff. After isos, I guess I should say that like we have ISO zone 3, which would be 10 seconds or less, really, really hard. And those are, if you get them right, they're going to turn into an EQI, right? They're going to end up being this thing where fatigue, either the first rep or a few reps into it, is going to make it not an isometric anymore. And you're going to be at the edge of a position that you can hold, which is why it's so potent. So we have shortening contractions, we have isometric contractions with a bunch of different variations, and then we finally have eccentrics. So if I want to prepare somebody for lengthening in this really isolated way, then we can go 2 up to a fully shortened contraction, slowly switch to 1, try to hold for a moment, and then smoothly, without any stops or starts along the way, lower that down all the way to a dead stop. So that's 2 up, switch to 1, and then lower down smoothly, smoothly, smoothly. No ratcheting, nothing like that. The hold when you switch to one leg is super important in helping you gauge how heavy it is, because if you switch over to that and you can just barely hold or you can't hold at all, and you're starting to be in that sweet spot where it's a really good eccentric. You have to gauge that with your tolerance. If it's really scary or feels really threatening, then you make it lighter. But usually the big benefit in eccentric contractions and focusing on the concentric and isolating the eccentric, let me be clear, the value of that is using a heavier weight than you could shorten on your own. So ideally, for an eccentric, I'm using a weight that I can't really budge. But if I drive up to 2 and switch to 1, I can get some work done with that amount of tension that I wouldn't be able to do in a shortening contraction. If you're training to climb your way out of an injury, like something associated with your quads or your knees, then eventually you're going to need to have a bridge to more dynamic actions that you're going to see in your sport if you're going to be running or jumping or changing directions. And the leg extension's utility doesn't stop with these isolated, simple versions of these contractions. It can also be a way to introduce a little bit of speed. So one way would be to think about oscillations, where I'm going to work in this mid-range position and kind of drop into a little bit of lengthening and then rapid shortening. And I could kind of find the edge of how quickly I can work with that. Pretty safe since we don't experience any true length or stretch, but we're at least getting this kind of coordination to shorten length and shorten length. And that could be a good bridge between static positions and hard contractions in big lifts with jumping and impact and things like that. The next piece would be really trying to think about the rate of loading to really get into tendons and connective tissue, because that's what they seem to be stimulated most by, is high rates of loading, where that loading ramps up quickly or comes out of nowhere. I could think about kind of catch reps where I switch from one leg to another and drop the weight onto my leg. So all of a sudden, I'm going from my left leg experiencing the load, and then I get all the weight dropping onto a hard isometric on the other leg. Like to follow that up with a few moments of iso to really own the position and see if it's heavy enough for me to hold, and then drop onto the other side. So the leg extension can offer a chance to be a little bit more dynamic, and in sort of a rehab context, that's often what's missing for people, is these in-between steps that take you from static strength to the things they need to be able to do in their sport. If you can find ways to have little intermediate steps and spread that out over as many intermediate steps and as much time as you can afford to, you have a better chance of your process really working. If you have access to a reverse hyper pendulum, which is usually used for the low back, if you have access to this type of machine, then you've got a chance to get exposure to a really interesting kind of emerging concept of muscle contraction, which is an oscillatory isometric muscle action, OIMA. These are described as isometrics where the loading is changing in this oscillatory way, where if we use a band to connect us to the loading, then that band is going to stretch and relax and stretch and relax in this rhythmic fashion, and my contraction needs to coordinate along with that. So if I grab on here and get this pendulum swinging a bit and then try to hold my position, it's harder. I have to contract hard when the pendulum pulls that band down, and then I get this moment of relaxation. If it's much heavier, then it's not true relaxation. It's not like an unloading, but it's at least a very hard and then less hard and you have to deal with that onset and that rate very much like a jump where you're absorbing that impact over a small amount of time and trying to stay stiff. So this is really useful. Again, a very interesting little bridge between isometric stuff. It could be the type of thing that you help bridge the gap to starting to have more impact and taking more length on landing. But ultimately, this leg extension sort of paradigm, that machine can be really useful because it gives you a lot of options of how you want to load tissue and how you want to take that to different things that you do in your training.